en route to America, he visits Tenerife for actually only 1 week, and this started 5th of June 1799. Well, he had a passport from the Queen of Spain, so he had access to all the kind of high society and all the support from the local authorities. This is something that Darwin later did not have. When Darwin came to Tenerife, the Beagle was refused access to the port. This was because only a little over 30 years before, Nelson tried to actually capture Santa Cruz and failed, and there was bad relationships between Spain and the UK at the time. And so the Beagle was told there's a cholera epidemic in Santa Cruz. There's no record of a cholera epidemic that year, so this was a diplomatic kind of coup in order to make sure that the British ship would not enter port. But Humboldt had a different setup. He had a letter from the Queen, and this opened all the doors for him. So he comes here for 1 week, he visits the Volcano, he visits La Laguna, the capital, he visits the Anaga forest, and of course the Orotava Valley. Here's the Orotava Valley, which was the agricultural hub at the time, and also a lot of noble families were clustering in that area, and there was a lot of money in that area. So he does a lot of research in that single week, and it's so impressive. So he really was the first volcano researcher, so to say, that traveled to the Canary Islands. So he had also a very busy social calendar, loads of dinners with the noble families here, and apparently there was a little flirt with one of the young daughters of one of the noble families, but I couldn't find out a lot of details about that. So, but he has eventually to cancel a trip to San Juan de las Ramblas, which is along the north coast of Tenerife, because the Beagle then, sorry, not the Beagle, his ship was then sailing off. Beagle was Darwin's ship, and he had to cancel his last trip that he still wanted to do, but he visits the botanical gardens in addition to several other places, of course. So, but let's talk a little bit about his achievements. And one of the things he was so keen to do was to establish the height of Teide Volcano, the presumably tallest peak in the world. Well, he sets out to do that, and he's not the first to try that. Several attempts had been made before. The last one before him was by Charles Baudin, a French researcher, in 1776. And the way it was done was by triangulation. You take two known points and you try to work out the third one by, well, geometrical calculation. And he realizes rather quickly, well, the peak of Teide is not that close to the sun, and he doesn't actually have to be worried about being burned when he goes up there. That's a very important realization. And here's the different estimates of Teide's height, Teide's altitude, and you can see it goes back to well, Italian researchers and all sorts of folks who had a go, and here we go through the years, and indeed Charles Baudin actually had a very good estimate with 3,713 meters. And then Humboldt came in 1799, and he comes up with 3,736 meters. And as you realize, all the other estimates are completely off. None of them overlaps, but this one here overlaps almost perfectly with the previous estimate. That was the first match, and that meant Humboldt kind of got it. But Humboldt was perfectly aware that the French gentleman Charles Baudin actually did the real job. So there's this quote by Humboldt, and everybody gave him the credit, but he realized it wasn't his, so he says there's 3 stages of scientific discovery. First, people deny it's true. Then they deny it's important. And finally, they credit the wrong person. So, and it's actually, to a degree, it's still true today. I find in science that it may not always be the first person like Charles Baudin who works it out. It may be the one who kind of makes the finding public, and that person may get more credit. So here Humboldt was standing on the shoulders of a French giant, if you will, and he got the credit for it. So, but then there was this other problem, and that was the eruption. And here we have a drawing, again from a French researcher, about the 1798 eruption. Of course, by the time Humboldt arrives, the eruption had stopped, but he was able to look at the rocks there, and he was going up to Teide volcano, and nowadays we can go there with a cable car. Of course, he had to go on the back of a mule for most parts, and on foot. And he climbs the summit of Teide, and this is a few impressions from the summit cone of Teide, and there's a bit of sulfur here, volcanic sulfur, and there's this little peak here sitting above the main part of the volcano. This peak comes from a medieval eruption, and it's a young feature of the volcano. And well, Humboldt starts to feel that some things are a bit odd with this concept of basalt forming on the ocean floor, because he sees that there's lava coming from the peak and running downhill, but never ever reaching the ocean floor. So he starts to get very skeptical at that point. Allegedly, he also visits the ice cave, and some of the porters he employed, they wanted to go to the ice cave. The reason was that they would pick ice there, and they would bring it down to Orotava, and they would sell the ice to the rich people to make sorbets. So the porters were very keen to make an extra penny because they were up there already. So he visits the ice cave because some of the porters wanted to break some ice and bring it down. So Humboldt is struck not just by the volcanic features, but also by the sparse vegetation. And he realizes that altitude has an effect on vegetation. So he also notes that there is this crown of forest, the corona forestal, and you see it coming in here, and suddenly it stops. It's really sharp, actually, once you look at it from a distance. And here we have this pine forest, and at a certain altitude of about 2,000 meters, it just dies off. So here's a few more impressions. He also notes that there is what we nowadays call the Sea of Clouds, and that this is a main source of moisture for the pine forest. And he sees all these links that nobody has really made beforehand. And he draws these sketches with a peak of Teide, and he sees that the plant life changes, that the pine forest comes in at about 1,000 meters altitude and stops at 2,000, that you have palm trees in the lower part, and that the clouds coincide with where the forests are, the pine forest, and he starts to draw this and makes these links. He was very good at visualizing things, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, because he was the first to draw things in illustrations that we nowadays call cartoons in scientific papers. He was really pioneering this concept. So, and he also, of course, notes that the vegetation at the coast is very lush, and this is where the agriculture happens. This is where you can grow bananas and pineapples, etc., etc. And higher up it changes towards the forests, which are maybe useful for timber, but not for traditional agriculture. So he comes up with this sketch here, and here the distribution of plants, and in vertical direction. And here he says the palm trees down here, agricultural fields, and then there is a leafy forest, and then there's pine forest, and then above a certain level there is no forest left, and only a few shrubs are left, and then we go to the peak of Teide, and he recognizes this change, and he concludes that the change in altitude that plants see is actually similar to the change in latitude. If you go up towards the North Pole, you will see similar changes. So he also realized on that trip that, well, this idea about lava and ocean water doesn't really work so well, and he would have seen these rocks. I don't have a record of this, but he would have seen them on the way. This is the Lavas Negras. This is a medieval eruption of Teide volcano, and if you happen to have a chance to go to the Teide National Park, you will also see them. They're striking. They're shiny black obsidian lavas, and they come from the peak, and they come down into the lower part of the Caldera de las Cañadas, but they don't go further. So he would have seen where the lavas came from and that they stopped. No ocean floor involved, and this would have made him think that something wasn't quite right with this traditional concept that his teacher, Professor Werner, would have told him. So here's a few impressions of this, and this is how these rocks look like. There you have flow banding in the rocks, and they're very shiny, they're obsidian, and here's a classic tongue of the lava coming down here, and then it stops, and this is not an ocean floor feature. In fact, if you look at the map today, this is a modern map of the Lavas Negras, which erupted in about 1150 before present. You'll see that they all stop here. And there's this beautiful road here, and I always make that joke with the students that the lava was very kind, it just stopped before hitting the road, but of course the road is younger. And here we see that none of these lavas ever reached the sea. It's very obvious they emanated from the volcano, and they didn't go to the ocean, never saw any ocean, and Humboldt was smart enough to realize that. So, I mentioned this story about Orotava. He was very much in love with Orotava, and some people say it's because of this daughter of one of the noble families, but of course it was surely also a very lovely site. It was very lush, very green, and there he had a viewpoint looking down into the valley, and it's still known as Humboldt's viewpoint. You can go there today, and he describes 3 volcanic cones. And well, people were a bit skeptical, because if you go there today, you only see 1.5. One is half gone, and one is still there. This one has a hotel, this one has a church on top, and the third one was never found. It turns out the third one was quarried away for the little particles, and now it's been actually found. It sits, it's sat behind this third one, this second one here. So, but it's completely gone. And this one here is heavily damaged. You see this side. So it's now protected. It cannot be quarried anymore. But of course, it lost its original beauty. And this is a bit sad, because Humboldt apparently said, "I'm leaving almost with tears in my eyes. I would like to settle here." He liked the Orotava Valley so much, and this is a statue of Humboldt sitting there looking at the Orotava Valley. So if you go there, you can actually look at the same perspective that he had. Now, having said this, we must also realize it did a lot of good, this concept of using volcanic particles. I talked about it the other day, and this is something that has been widely used, and he actually makes reference to this. And here we have these Lageria fields on Lanzarote, which some of you would have seen today, but well, unfortunately. So you can see some of them here. It's no perfect replacement, I'm sure, but people there recognized very quickly spreading volcanic material on the fields is very good, makes the soil more fertile. Once you manage to protect the plants against the wind, either by having them in small depressions or by building little shelter walls, then you can suddenly grow a lot of crops there that wasn't able previously. And here, one of the valleys in Lanzarote, and you see the entire valley floor is full with these little walls and these little depressions, and wine is grown there. And I mentioned it the other day, the wine from the Canaries got so famous it was drank at the Vienna Congress in 1816, where Europe was subdivided into a pre-Napoleonic kind of arrangement again, and the nobles of Europe enjoyed the Canary wine, and it was considered one of the finest wines in the world at the time.